war poets. Okay, so interesting because you have a variety of writings. All right, and then it is very important to understand today even how you can attune war poets to an Indian scenario. All right, like, as a researcher, I would also want you to look at the kind of writings which are emerging at the behest of war. For example, if you observe in our popular media, popular culture, you might have seen this movie, let's say Kashmir Files. You might have seen the movie, for that matter, Sardar Udham Singh. You might have seen the movie Sher Shah, okay, Shahenshah, or all these movies, are all what we are looking at the consequences of war. All right. So one way, which way do we look at war? Some people have looked at war in a patriotic way. Some people have looked at war in a heroic way. Some people have looked at war with a sense of purpose. You know what they call this kind of world war was at that particular point, England was, England was rather docile, idle at that particular point. And it so happened that England at that particular point, when World War began, people suddenly felt that they've been given some meaning in their life. They were so happy. There was these lines which I would want you to read it aloud for you. Just a moment, which I have, penned it down here. Right. I'm just reading it aloud for you because it's very important. Exactly like this. When World War I started, people cheered in the streets. Their enthusiasm was soon dampened by the reality of the war. The disillusionment which followed the conflict shaped our modern world. All right. So here we look at war poetry. When we look at war poetry, we look at three wars. One being the Holocaust. You understand Holocaust very well. Holocaust poetry, Holocaust writings have been rampant till this particular point. And the second one, what you talk about is Blitz. What is Blitz? Blitz is the German bombing campaign against UK in 1940-41. Okay, that was the time of Second World War. And then, the exact German term is Blitzkrieg, what is known as a lightning war. All right, so under this backdrop is what these war poets have emerged. So what is this? The war poet is a kind of extreme emotion at the very edge of experience. These were warriors, or let's say they were fighting the war and then they took to account war. Okay, and then you might have observed this kind of war poet, and its writing is very different from the kind of writing like how I cited intentionally Spencer. Spencer writes with nationalism, Spencer writes with patriotism, but here war poets are portraying to us a very negative picture of war. Okay, we're talking about Irish soldiers and their experiences are being portrayed at the time of the First World War. And then when we're talking about war, we're talking about the war itself. We talk about pity. We talk about, definitely, war brings a death, brings about pity, tragic death, horrors, and protests against the war. All right. So maybe you might say, so is it war? Is it anti-war? Many people write to account war. And there was the other kind of writings in war poetry, which actually try to portray an anti-war kind of a writing. So here we look at a fact where early poets and the late poets, you're able to see this. The early poets talked about, the cause of war, why war came about, and honor. Whenever we talk of war, we always talk about honor, like, people who died, they've achieved martyrdom and they've got a lot of honor because they died. But it's also to understand, what is the effect, the toll the war takes on the family. All right, the person or the Jawan or the soldier or the warrior who dies in the war, what is the toll that this kind of an incident takes on the family? That is always forgotten, right? The honor and the patriotism and the bling of war is at one side, but the other side is not so rosy, they like in picture. The later poets, like I said, had an anti-war. They did not want war. They portrayed to us the horrors of war. They portrayed to us the loss of war. They portrayed as a very hard, cold reality. So that when we portray to you war in this particular way, at least the public would try to understand that, war is not something which has to be entertained, because it's not something which is rosy. It is not that people are going for war. It's always about heroism, because some places, the people, the way they die is so pathetic that their bodies are not found, and the way they die is so groggy at that point. So it's not always about honor. We are portraying the hard realities, the negative connotations of war, the reality of war, which is beyond patriotism, nationalism, beyond the stars and the honors which has always been associated with war poets. All right, so we talk about this as In Flanders Fields by a Canadian, John McRae. So which begins with the lines, in Flanders Fields, the poppies blow, between the crosses, row on row, between the crosses. People, you understand, right? It is exactly like, you might understand that these poetries have been written because of the warriors who have died because of the war, and then their tombstone is there, and on the tombstone there is the cross, all right, a Christian symbol, okay, the tombstone, and on top of it is the cross. Between the crosses there are those poppies. What are those red poppies? Those red poppies are actually a symbol of let's say, what do you say, the symbol of death of many people who have died in, especially in the World War I. The red poppy remains a well-known symbol for World War I in Great Britain in particular, and for veterans in general. I'm going to take you through a certain poetries which I have penned down as I'm going to go ahead with it. You also talk about something which I might have forgotten. These are poetry written by soldiers, you get that. And then they also talked about, I'm talking specifically because about the anti-war kind of a poetry. You also see about how isolation and imminent death, governed the scenario at that particular point. So you had Edward Thomas. Edward Thomas was one of those soldiers who was again a poet laureate at that particular point, who was trained for 2 years, and then during his first battle, he died. All right. So what we are talking about, suddenly in the behest of war, man understands the priority of relationship to himself. All right, nothing else matters. What matters is what you are, yourself matters. So that projection, that isolation, that involvement with the self, that prioritizing your own self, because you is what exists, because we don't even know if you are permanent. That only right now what I have is my body and me. So that has to be given some kind of an identity. That is why these kind of writings which came up. All right, so right, we always talk about this heroic image, right? Many people would want to enter into a war, and then, it's like you're dying for the nation. That kind of a patriotism was portrayed in a more realistic way, right? Yeah, patriotism is at one edge, but we're looking at the groggy deaths, what many people go through because of war, and then that is not very a very honorable death, the way they die. Sometimes their bodies are not found, sometimes their eyes are pulled out, one eye is not there, they're terribly injured, and then that is a more realistic portrayal of war that talks about. One more thing, people, whenever we talk about war poet and its writing, you talk about especially the army. We're talking about army here. Soldiers is what we use. So when we talk of army, they are the symbol of masculinity. You know that, you might have observed it in the movie, if you've watched the movie Gunjan Saxena as well. Exactly, there comes a point where this feeble female is called for a fist war with one of her superiors, or one of her reporting authorities, and then he says that you are weak, and then that's the reason you're not supposed to be there in the army. Exactly like that. We looked at these soldiers who, what do you say, a struggle arm to arm, but then we somehow saw the vulnerabilities of masculinity. That is what we saw. And then you can also observe here the idea of impermanence, something which is very dominant, which came about or brought to us what we call in present day scenarios as abstract literature. Not abstract, absurd literature. So sorry, absurd literature, the theater of the absurd, the coming of Samuel Beckett and his writings, were all a consequence of this isolation, were all a consequence of this impermanence. The fact that war is, I don't know, it might be, the materialism of which I'm a part of, the age, the materialistic age. Tomorrow, my property is not going to be mine. My people are not going to be with me. There is no permanence of my property and my people. Then what is permanent? That impermanence is being questioned. That uncertainty is being questioned. And then, what did we do? We tried to look at the dead soldiers. Perhaps they achieved their calm through nature. So many of those writings, what we see is, those dead soldiers have just been buried. So, what do you say? The soil is quite soft because they've just now been buried. And, and the very fact that they are becoming a part of nature, and, from their life might sprung, let's say, spring, we see them as, somehow they have, what do you say? They have been to the recesses of calm, so that they can no longer listen to the sounds of war and the alarms and, the cries and the pain and the wails and the sound of the weaponry is no more audible. That so they are buried so deep, so that, the kind of life force which originates from that soil, that soft soil, is regenerative. At least that might, bring about some peace to the soldiers. This is the kind of writing that you see in here. And right, yeah, I would want you to, read these lines exclusively for you. That is, I have come to the borders of sleep, the unfathomable deep forest where all must live. So maybe you are reiterating to death. Sleep is what? Perennial death, for example. The unfathomable deep forest where all must lose. We think that death is not going to hit us, but at this particular point, death is just at the waiting at the doorstep of the soldier. Their way, however straight or winding, soon or late, they cannot choose. They cannot choose. They might die a little earlier, they might die a little late, but they're eventually going to die with time. And then many a road and track that since the dawn's first crack. So from the time, they woke up, or let's say, from the time that they were born, they took many roads and many tracks. And finally, they are at the edge of this forest where they're going to enter into a deep sleep forever. Upon the forest brink, derive the soldiers, the travelers suddenly now blurs and in this thing. So this road what they were traveling till now, suddenly it takes a dark turn so that there is nothing beyond this, because there's only darkness. What is it? The symbol of maybe, a forever sleep for that matter, or maybe death, which has come about to be. So this war poetry is very, very rampant today. Many people are a kind of researchers who are, in this session might also take into, studying war literature and what is the kind of outlook, maybe compare the kind of war poetry which exists earlier and the kind of portrayal of war poetry and war literature today. How has it transitioned? Has it remained the same? We've been into war then and we are into war now. I'm sure there are so many literatures which might have come up, maybe in the Afghanistan Taliban literature. Maybe you can talk about the Ukraine and the Russian under the backdrop of that, the kind of literature we came up. Why are we talking about this? We talk about partition literature. What do we see in partition literature? The kind of war and the after effects of war, what it resulted, the isolation of man, the kind of blackening which, happened as a consequence of war, that you see in literature. You see here Wilfred Owen, who was used his poetry, the title being "My Subject is War and the Pity of War." We are not talking about the grandeur of war, mind you. And, you're talking about the imagination of the horrors of war, bloodstain. That's what we look at. And we are giving the warning people, we are showing them this so that you understand that, perhaps it's a kind of a bell that is being rung for public to understand that war is all not about grandeur and patriotism. Their idea is real observations and experience of the war. The military expressions impacted his language, especially the toughness and the sharpness, right? For example, maybe it is a consequence of the modern age as well, that the kind of expression which came about was very tough, was very sharp, which influenced these writings because of, maybe you can say that the military had a very curt attitude. That curt attitude was translated into writings as well. Vivid images of darkness, guns, mud, rain, gas. Gas is a consequence of your Holocaust. Bullets, shells, barbed wire, rats, lice, coal, trenches. All these enrich the modern war poetry. Relation of immediate personal experience to moments of national and international crisis, extra literary importance. So what we're doing, we are looking at, true, many people who die in the war win that kind of martyrdom. But at that point, that is with respect to the nation, international and the national. But what is the personal experience? What is the family outlook? What do they go about with it? How is it that they see many times a kind of death, the soldiers experience in these kind of wars, you don't even get to see their bodies. The last, glimpse of that particular individual is also not, experienced by their family members. So that is the kind of loss, that you're even devoid of the last glimpse of the dead. That is, that raw, stark picture of war is also being portrayed beyond the heroism, patriotism under which, a war is clothed in. All right. So that was what it was looked at. All right. So we're talking about another writer whose name is Brooke. So Brooke gave us a picture before the First World War. All right. Like I told you, early war poetry and late war poetry. So before that, we talk about, we look at how it was a golden time only for the upper classes. You know about it, the bourgeoisie England, which existed in the before the modern age period. They felt that, there was a lot of, dominance of the royals over education, because only the affluent and the privileged were granted education and employment, and the rich and the powerful only could be the members of the society. And it felt that, the rich were becoming richer and the poor were becoming poorer, exactly like the Victorian compromise. And at that particular point, you observe, the war gave a huge shock to the system. All right, they felt that, there was a terrible human cost that they have to pay, which led to a more equal society. When they saw a war will not judge who is a rich and who is a poor. If they die, they die. The war is not going to differentiate between rich and the poor. All right, so the war actually dismantled the bourgeoisie culture. All right, so the poorer classes were largely the ones dying in the trenches as a result of orders issued by the untrained aristocratic generals living miles behind the lines. All right, so this bourgeoisie system came to light in the first place because many of the ones who were dying were the poor people. Also, the second thing that you observe here is, when there was a war, when the World War happened, it is not that only the poor who were affected, even the rich were affected. So finally, the bourgeoisie culture broke down because of the wars which happened. Like you can clearly understand, he led his platoon into the Battle of the Somme. He wrote to his mother every week and described what he had been through. Those 50 hours were the agony of my happy life. I nearly broke down and let myself drown in the water that was now rising slowly above my knees. In the platoon on my left, the sentries over the dugout were blown to nothing. All right, so this is exactly like, a live description of war. Maybe, you're trying to see people also, this kind of war poetry, brought in, how do you say, a kind of a reconciliation with the loneliness, the isolation which what brought in. Okay, so to whom would you talk to? What would you do? How is it that you would find one outlet? That was through writing. So perhaps, that's the reason why this literature also took shape. And then you understand, this has created a lot of shell shock. The war definitely cripples the mind of the soldiers who've seen horrific deaths and horrific loss and bloodshed and gruesome guerrilla warfare beside them. And then, they die unable to tolerate the shock that they've been a part of.